So let's go straight to the interview of Destiny's Way writer Walter Jon Williams.
Hello. How are you?
So I guess we're just going to start off at the very beginning. A lot of our listeners are also like to write. Most of them do like message board role playing or just write little short fiction, and we have writing contests and so on. So a lot of them would like to know how you got into writing and who your major inspirations were to begin.
Okay. Well, I always wanted to be a writer. I mean, I decided I wanted to be a writer when I was like 4 years old, before I knew how to read and write. And I would dictate stories to my parents, who would write them down. And then I'd get out my crayons and I'd illustrate them. So basically, I'd been working at it all my life. And I made my first sale when I think I was 25 years old. But I've been working at it for 20 years. And I worked pretty seriously at it. So that's how it started. My influences, there were so many, especially when I was a little kid. Rudyard Kipling, Edgar Rice Burroughs, Conan Doyle. I read everything.
Did you ever get to meet any of your influences or authors you highly, highly respected when you were younger?
When I was younger, no, not really. When I was after I was an adult, I met a great many of them. Samuel R. Delany, Roger Zelazny, Philip Jose Farmer, all sorts of people. Once I got into the sort of science fiction professional and fandom category. A lot of writers very generously made their time available to me, and I learned a lot from them.
Okay. And I know you started your career in historical fiction, and then you switched eventually to science fiction and so on. Just to continue introducing yourself, why don't we start with how you got into historical fiction, why you wanted to start writing there, and then how that transitioned to science fiction, and then we'll get into the bulk of our questions that I know Jason has a lot of.
Okay. Well, I didn't so much set out to be a historical writer as I set out to write a lot of different stuff. And the historical fiction was the stuff that sold. I was writing and submitting in practically all categories. Not science fiction. I didn't actually think I was good enough to be a science fiction writer. At least at that stage in my career, I had very high standards for science fiction because I knew so many terrific science fiction writers, and I knew I wasn't in their class, at least not yet. But historical fiction was the first thing that sold. And since a lot of your readers are gamers, they might be interested in this. I had designed a tabletop and role-playing game for the Age of Fighting sale, in which people could be, essentially Horatio Hornblower types or Jack Aubrey types. And I had done an enormous amount of research, and I thought, and so I decided to put that to other use, and I did a proposal for a historical sea adventure series, and it sold. And I wrote 5 books in that series, all of which are now available as ebooks. And the game, Heart of Oak and Privateers and Gentlemen, are both available on Drive-By Games, which is kind of a vintage game site that will sell you a PDF. So for those of you, those readers and listeners who are interested in that kind of game, you might want to check that out.
So the series Privateers and Gentlemen, this is kind of like in the lines of something that a lot of people might be able to relate to, like a Master and Commander type series?
Yes, except my protagonists were American.
Okay.
Rather than British, which is kind of shocking to some readers. I had one friend who is Canadian, and her son read these books, and he came to his mother very disturbed and said, "He's writing about the wrong side."
Well, to be fair, when it comes to like fiction or even movies and so on about that sort of thing, they're almost always either British or Spanish.
Yeah.
Very few American side, even though there are, John Paul Jones and so on, famous Americans that did
Yeah,
do that.
well, we have a ton of early naval heroes. One problem, as far as that goes, is that if you're British, if you have protagonist is British, he's got potentially the American Revolution, which is almost runs 10 years. And then within a few years after that, the wars of the French Revolution and Napoleon start, and that runs 20 years. So you can get an entire lifetime of adventure with one protagonist. In my case, I had a family, a nautical family, that started out as privateers in the American Revolution, and then by the time the War of 1812 started, we were into the second generation who were either privateers or naval officers. So I was able to sort of jump that over by introducing new characters with each generation. And I had plans to go on with the Mexican War and the Civil War, but the market for historical fiction completely collapsed before I was able to quite finish the series and get into the third generation.
Now that it's on ebook, have you ever wanted to just jump in and finish it?
I thought about it. There are a number of other things I'd probably rather finish first, but at the moment, I just have too many other projects.
So speaking as a Brit jumping in the conversation here, I'm interested to know the era that you were writing about is a kind of a fairly well understood era of American history, it's fair to say. How much research did you have to do beyond the knowledge that you already had? How much did you have to dig into the specific details, or even just what it was like to live at that time? Did you have to do a lot of digging, appreciating that it wasn't the longest?
I had to do a great deal, because you can find out about the American Revolution from a textbook, but it won't tell you what it's like to be on an American man of war. For that, you have to do some very detailed research and very specialized research. And also, because my characters were living in that period, I had to find out a lot about the social history and what it was actually like to live in that period. I found it later much easier to write science fiction because I could make so much of that stuff up.
Right. It's very interesting.
So I'm curious. I know you're a scuba diver and you travel. Have you ever been able to visit any of the wrecks of these old ships that still exist that people can dive to and visit either in museums or just diving to?
Well, I've seen a lot of the museum ships. I've seen the Constitution in Boston. I've seen the Constellation in Baltimore. I've seen the Victory and the Warrior and so on in Great Britain. But no. For one thing, a lot of the locations of sunken warships are unknown, or they're unavailable. They're not available to the sport diver. If you had a bathysphere or something, you might be able to view them. But also, it's discouraged to visit these ships because they are considered military graveyards. And the U.S. Navy's policy is completely hands-off, do not touch. And they're not very comfortable with people diving those sites.
I see. Well, that's interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah.
I just thought if people can visit the Titanic, they can visit other ships.
Well, the Titanic is kind of out there by its. I mean, Robert Ballard, who discovered the Titanic, never thought this would be an issue with the Titanic because it just takes so much effort to get down there. And now there's kind of Titanic tourism. It's a lot of money, but they can, they will take you out on the ship and drop the ROVs, and you can get a first-hand view of the Titanic and send your little robots where you want them, presumably. And so Robert Ballard never thought it would be an issue with people scavenging from that wreck because it would, you'd have to be somebody with heavy-duty government backing to even get there. But that's not the case anymore. It turns out there are a lot of little ROVs available. So yeah, that is a potential problem.
I mean, there are
Clyde Cussler I'm sorry.
Jason, go.
Sorry, I was just going to say there are plenty of other shipwrecks that you can reach that are accessible, even ones that are on shore and stuff. So, there are plenty out there. But in terms of the ones that are from that era, the ones that are military, the ones that are near the US coast, certainly that's a different kettle of fish. was going to bring us away slightly from the sort of historical books, but I'm quite impressed and quite amazed, really, that the range of genres that you've been able to write. I'm not somebody who can settle down and spend 20 years writing the same book series. I'm incredibly impressed that George R. R. Martin, who I know you've met and associated with, that he can stick to one thing. So I'm kind of interested to see.
Well, I think the thing about George is he's never stuck to one thing. I mean, I've known George since the 70s, and he was writing, science fiction for a while. Then he was writing horror. Then he was writing for Hollywood, and he was doing wild cards. It was a project in which I was a part, and the Song of Ice and Fire came fairly late in his career. And that's what he's known for, but he's written a lot of different stuff.
He doesn't even stick to finishing the series he's working on. He always writes other books in between them.
Well, not other books necessarily, but he doesn't. Yeah, he doesn't. He doesn't. Well, if you're writing a long project like that, you need to take a breather now and again. True.
It's just frustrating when you want to wait 6 years. Don't want to wait 6 years between books.
Yeah. Well, neither does George, believe me.
The question I've asked a few people before is how different is it to write in different styles, different genres? Do you have to change your approach? But I guess the question I want to ask you is slightly different, which is when you're changing from one series to another, is it difficult to switch your mindset, and do you have to spend some time easing into a different genre, or do you just pick up a pen and write and it's just easy for you?
It varies from book to book. Sometimes my books are very difficult to write, and I never know why. And sometimes they're very easy. I found it easier to switch from historical fiction to science fiction because in each case, you are writing of someone who is not in your own time, which means that you end up using a lot of the same techniques. I had to find ways of easily describing what it is like to be on a wooden man of war, sail-powered man of war, and how all the rigging works and what the commands are to make the rigging work and how the cannons work and all of that. And I couldn't just sit down and deliver a lecture to the reader. Or I could have, but I didn't want to. So I had to find ways of containing that information within the story. And that's the same technique you use for science fiction when you're writing about a world that the reader would never have experienced. You have to have ways of working the exposition into the story so that the story reveals the world as the reader moves through it.
And you obviously have a huge amount of world building for both sort of distant past and distant future.
Yeah.
Was it
Although
easy?
For the War of 1812, I didn't have to build that world. I just had to discover it myself.
That's the question I was going to ask is the world obviously already exists in terms of the one behind and the one forward you have to completely come up with from scratch. But was it easier to come up with something because you didn't have to base it on reality? Or was it easier to just take somebody else's world and sort of reimagine it?
On the whole, I found it a little easier. I mean, I still had to do enough research to make sure that the science was plausible, and so on. And sometimes the research will mislead you. There was, I made the mistake for one book of using an obsolete astronomy text. I didn't realize it was obsolete. It was only 10 years old. But it had a lot of stuff in it that was no longer true. They just found out a lot more about astronomy in that 10-year period. So I had some obsolescent astronomy in one of my books, and I was kind of called on it by some people who knew better than I did. And all I could say was, I did my research. And, possibly I should have been digging into astronomy journals and reading all the papers, but, there's only a certain amount of time in which you get to research this stuff before you have to sit down and write.
A lot of the genres that you've worked in seem to be a mishmash of lots of different genres, like Metropolitan and City of Fire, which is like cyberpunk and fantasy put together.
Yeah.
In kind of strange ways. You've done, space operas and gothic westerns, science fiction, and so on.
Yes, I have in fact written the world's only gothic western science fiction police procedural.
I actually just read Days of Atonement, and it's interesting. I'll say that. The first time I read it, I was like, I'm not sure exactly what I'm reading yet. Takes a little bit to get used to, but once you do, it's quite a good book. So a lot of these ones, did you have ideas to mix all these together, or how many of these books have you written that, like an editor or a publisher said, you should write this type of book, and they just throw it at you, and then you come up with your idea for it?
For the most part, all the ideas are mine. And then you take them to a publisher, and they will either buy them or not. In one case, my space opera series, Dread Empire's Fall, that was an idea from an editor. She said, if you wrote a space opera, I would buy it. And as it happens, I already had a space opera idea. It was sort of farther down my list of priorities. And because I always have about 12 or 20 or 50 books that I want to write, and the ones that I most desperately want to write are kind of on the top of the pile. And so that one moved from like fourth or fifth in the pile to the top of the pile once the editor actually expressed interest in something like that.
Once they're like, you're going to be paid automatically. Oh, okay, I'm in.
Yeah.
So
now, sometimes that hasn't worked. I mean, there's been a recent case of an editor who solicited something from me and then didn't buy it. Actually, was not allowed to buy it. And that's kind of discouraging.
Sorry. Did it work the same way with like I know on your site you say you've written movies that were never made, but did they approach you to write those movies, or were they your ideas sent in?
Originally it was producers contacted me to do movie adaptations of my books, and so I had contact, and then I was able to pitch them new ideas and sell those. I didn't actually want to be the person to adapt my books. I didn't think I was the right person for that. Because in order to adapt a book to the screen, you have to cut 90% of the stuff that you love.
I think the only one I can remember where the author actually wrote the screenplay and it worked really well was Gone Girl recently. I can't think of another one the author themselves wrote.
Possibly, yeah.
Because I know the author of that one.
I've read the book. I haven't seen the movie. So, but yeah, it's adaptation. That kind of adaptation is an art, and I didn't think I was appropriate for that. I ended up having to adopt one of my books because it was kind of a last resort thing. It was the producer told me, either you have to do this or nobody will. So I did it, and I got paid, but nobody liked the results, least of all me.
I see.
Sorry.
I know we have a lot of questions about a project that you were brought into that isn't your universe, because a lot of our listeners are huge Star Wars fans, and you got to work. You wrote Destiny's Way, one of the pivotal books in a massive 19-book series, The New Jedi Order. And I think Jason should probably start off with these questions since he came up with the bulk of them.
All right.
I wouldn't go that far. Lots of people fed in, but no, I've always said it's the book of the series for me. It encapsulates from start to finish in one novel. But the thing I'd be interested in is obviously some of the people who wrote in that series have been writing Star Wars books for a while. Have written it in other had written standalone books or trilogies, and a lot of them had written early in the series and then later on in the series. There are only about 3 or 4 people, yourself included, who jumped in late on, having not written before in the series. I'm just, how much effort did you have to put in to catch up and to not miss out all the things that had gone on before, and to understand what you were writing about?
Well, that was actually that was very challenging, because as soon as I agreed to do it, boxes of material started appearing on my doorstep. I'd open these boxes, and there'd be like the official Star Wars companion to droids, and the official Star Wars companion to planets and moons, and the official Star Wars companion to spaceships, and just all of this stuff, and the illustrated encyclopedia and the encyclopedia, and a whole lot of the novels, and anyway, this stuff just kept showing up over weeks and months, and that was pretty intimidating to figure out what I actually needed to know. And so it became a totally immersive experience. I think it took about 5 or 6 months to write that book, which is, I normally take longer with a book that size, but, I had a deadline. I didn't get to read the books that immediately preceded mine.
Right.
So there were, so there were some difficulties in that. There's a certain amount of redundancy between the books that immediately precede mine, because they had some of the same ideas. But there was, by that point, it was too late in the process. There really wasn't anything I could do to change it.
How long? Well, actually, what year did you start in the project? Because we know Vector Prime came out. Ari Salvatore's book came out in '99, and the project ran until 2004 or 5.
Mm-hmm.
And it's 19 books. How far into it were you brought into, or were you brought in at the beginning when they had those giant meetings?
No, I was brought in a little later. I did fly out to Skywalker Ranch for meetings, but it was me, it was Jon Williams, and it was the people from the Lucasfilm. And a rather substantial crew for that. But by that point, they had the arc of the series hammered out, and they had some idea of what was going to happen in each volume. And I was very glad I was handed the volume that I was, because it enabled me to really advance the story in some significant ways. So I was very pleased with that.
It's possibly the book that has the most plot content. We were talking about this. We've done a series on all of the Star Wars books that have ever been released, pretty much. And Star by Star is pretty much the only other one that contains quite that level of depth. Some of the books are part 1 and part 2, and probably together still add up the same size as Destiny's Way. Were you ever talking about splitting it into multiple books,
no.
or was it always just the one series?
It didn't come up. I think because there were certain crucial things that had to happen in that book. And so splitting it up into 2 books would have just complicated all that too much. Assuming they ever considered that at all. They may not have. Because the deadlines on that series were fierce, and the publication deadlines were really fierce. So I not only had to have the book in by a certain date, but all the edits and the copy edits, et cetera, had to be done by a certain date. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been able to get into print on time, and that would have been a real mess. So a lot of if your listeners are wondering why some of the Star Wars books are imperfect, that's why. You could have one really perfect Star Wars book a year, or you could have 8 or 10 or 12 imperfect books a year. Which would you prefer? The market says we want more Star Wars books.
Were you brought into that project by Del Rey or Lucasfilm themselves, or were you brought in because you knew a lot of the other authors and they recommended you?
I know Del Rey contacted my agent, and I had been contacted to do series work before, but I had been unable to because I just had too many commitments. And this was a case of I had nothing on my immediate horizon. And they wanted a book from me, and so I jumped for it. Yeah.
And you joined mid-season. Had you heard of the series of books? Had you ever read a Star Wars book before at all? Were you kind of aware of them, or were you?
I was certainly aware because I knew people who had written them, but I hadn't read them. No. I regret to say my reading time is incredibly limited. And so I had been reading other stuff. But actually, I was quite impressed with the stuff that I read, just how comprehensively they had developed the Star Wars universe as a collaborative effort, because I know that's hard, because I've done collaborative projects like Wildcards, and there are specific challenges for things like that.
Cool. Okay.
I'm just desperately trying not to take the bait of then launching into a tirade about the abolition of the Star Wars expanded universe. I'll leave that question aside for another day.
No, I actually have a comment on it. It's not a tirade, but let's just say I wasn't surprised because I'm familiar with how Hollywood works. And in order for the expanded universe to be a part of this new series, somebody at Disney, somebody fairly high-ranking, would have had to sit down and read 100 books, or however many there are, and a whole lot of comics. and played all the games. They're not going to. You know, they don't have the time, and they can get someone else to do coverage, what is called coverage, which means you read this book for me and tell me what's in it. But you know, nobody gets paid a lot for doing stuff like that. It's usually in addition to their other work. So, you know, a producer might say to the secretary, "Give me coverage on this book," but that's one book. That's not 100 books.
Yeah, absolutely. I do understand the point. It's just the point that you made about it being such. I mean, it was the most developed universe that has ever been in fiction. It's a shame that it is no longer treated on the same level of importance. That, you know, there aren't people trying to read lots of books to understand the world they're writing in. And we'll see how much of it is undone by the films. But I'll bring us away from that and just ask the question that in your book, without giving too many spoilers away, you get to, or you have to, depending on your perspective, kill off a few quite well-known characters, actually.
Right.
And
can I mention their names because this is a 12-year-old book or whatever. So I don't want to give spoilers,
but it. As long as we alert people there are spoilers, and if they don't want to, then they can skip on a few minutes, then we're happy.
Okay. Well, there were certain things that had to happen in my particular volume. Okay, the Republic had to have a big victory. Okay, the first big victory. And now the spoilers start. Okay. I had to bring Shimra to the capital. Stick your fingers in your ears and go, yeah, and this won't last long. I had to kill the War Master because once Shimra's on stage, the War Master is redundant. Okay, I had to kill Vergere because once Jason has got sort of the second dispensation from her, she becomes redundant. Otherwise, the story is all about her. So she had to die for the same reason that Kenobi had to die in the first movie, because otherwise it becomes Kenobi's story, right? So these and a few other minor things had to happen. The rest of the story was all mine, although Lucasfilm had to approve all of it, and there were some things they didn't approve. So, okay, I don't know how you give the signal that people can take their fingers out of their ears now, but
they can't yet, because I'm going to ask a question specifically about Akbar being the most pivotal of the group, and the sort of and the film characters, I guess, is the changes to their personality, particularly, I guess, the beginning of the very, very long fall of Jason over the coming several book series, and the reactions of Leia and Han to that. How hard was it to try and get into the head of very well-known, very well-loved characters, but in a different stage of life where their personalities have changed?
Yeah, that was tough. Fortunately, Jason had been the subject of the, James Lucina's Traitor, the immediately previous book. Right, so I didn't have to deal with him too much. All I had to deal with was his working through the changes that had happened to them in that. So I wanted a scene of him healing, so that I put him out on the reef and gave him, some scuba gear and had him paddle around and work out stuff in his head. I just wanted a healing scene. Jaina, I came up with the Sword of the Jedi for her as part of her, because it occurred to me that that any actual human being by now would be experiencing combat fatigue, and Jaina had the twin bond and the connection with the Force and so on, which could allow her to keep it together longer. But I wanted to have she was literally in the war from day one, and had got to be a witness to a whole lot of catastrophes, including the death of her brother. And so I wanted to have her react to all of that. So that was her arc. And so those were things that I was very concerned about. And the other thing was that as I read all this material preparatory to working on the story, I realized that Star Wars and the expanded universe is the first introduction for a lot of readers to the world of ideas, big ideas. And so I wanted to make sure that the ideas that I inserted in there would not be toxic in some way. Or that if they were toxic, that they were labeled as toxic, so that people would understand they were toxic. Nama Noor's ideas, they're pretty toxic. But he's clearly not somebody to emulate. So those were some of my concerns as I set to work.
So how many? You mentioned how you had him scuba diving, which is definitely something that it comes from yourself. Mm-hmm. How much of yourself did you put into that book? Because we write what we know. So how much of your experiences traveling or your hobbies and so on did you stick into that book because it's what you knew best?
Well, I got to have scenes on a water planet, and I do scuba, and I used to teach small boat sailing. A lot of that background was useful in describing the sorts of things that happen there, that happen in a water environment. I'm just familiar with it. I've also been doing Kempo karate for now over 30 years. A lot of the martial arts, the applied philosophy of the martial arts, and so on, was either my own experience or in some cases taken from my teacher.
That makes a lot of sense. And so the martial arts also helped you do with some of the action scenes, because some of the, when you're fighting a Wuzhan Vong, you have the staffs and so on, and not all the writers can write that very well. Mm-hmm. And yours was one of the ones that you can actually follow the action a lot better, as opposed to they just say the action happens.
Yeah, well, thank you. I work hard on that. And it helps that I've experienced a fair amount of it too. So yes, that's one indication that's one place where my background was really useful. And also, one of my hobbies is reading philosophy. So when Vergeer gives essentially the second dispensation, a lot of that is I was able to borrow from great philosophers of the past. Vergeer's philosophy is very Spinozan. She's very close to Benedict Spinoza, who is one of my main men philosophically speaking. Nama Noor is more of a Nietzschean, and he's concerned with matters with the will to power, as Nietzsche would have put it. So, and unfortunately, some of his ideas kind of got edited out at the last second. So we didn't get as full an exploration of his sort of mental journey as I would have liked.
Are there any scenes or things that you had in the book or you wanted to put in the book that they said specifically no, or this just wouldn't fit either for time or you couldn't get it right, that you can share with us?
Okay, here's one that when the second trilogy appeared, everyone was a little surprised that Jedi weren't allowed to marry. In the past, this was a brand new restriction that appeared for the point, which made good drama in the films, but it tended to call a lot of the expanded universe into question, where all of these Jedi are having relationships and getting married, and Luke Skywalker gets married. Wait, I thought they weren't allowed. And so what I wanted to have was, Mara was pregnant with Ben, and I wanted to have an explanation of why Jedi weren't allowed to marry, because that wasn't provided in the film, and nobody quite understood why. And my thought was that an infant being carried in the womb and being exposed to a lot of active force powers going on all around its environment might become prematurely connected to the force and become really a real wild card. Might become essentially possessed by the force in some way. And so I was going to have Ben turn into a scary little kid. And they said no. And I perfectly, and I didn't think they were going to say yes, but I put it in anyway, into my proposal, and they said no, and I was perfectly prepared for them to say no.
So basically, using the Force is like using drugs when you're pregnant.
Yeah.
Interesting. That would have been a very interesting idea to put in there, though I can see why they'd say no to it, because it can potentially hurt some of their upcoming characters, but at the same time, would be very interesting to delve into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was. Yeah, I think probably I complicated the expanded universe enough in that one book without introducing that element. So
it would have been interesting.
It was understandable if they didn't want that. They had other plans for Ben, I'm sure.
Yeah. It would have been interesting to read the background to the sort of prequels, Jedi mythology. There's not a huge amount of explanation for how they became that way from how we've seen in other things, and how they transitioned from then to Luke, without Luke coming across our documents that says very clearly, don't do this and this. So the New Jedi series had quite a lot of philosophy in it, so I would have loved to have read a bit more myself. My favorite books from that perspective were, Traitor was pretty much an entire book about philosophy from start to finish, which I loved, and then the Unifying Force at the end was less philosophical, but more about the sort of the Force and the sort of philosophy of the Force, which I loved from that perspective as well. It would have been really interesting to see what you gave to that mix with perhaps, I don't want to speculate about every other author, but perhaps with a bit more of a firm background in that field, I guess. You mentioned earlier about the sort of coming up with the Sword of the Jedi tag, for a better phrase. Obviously, this became a relatively major thing, and was going to be a trilogy of novels. It was one of only a few books that we knew about that were cancelled by the Disney takeover. Did you have much in mind when you came up with the Sword of the Jedi? Was it just a phrase?
I have to say that was that scene was dictated by the Force. I mean, I was told I had to have a knighting ceremony, and who got to be knighted. So I wanted Luke to have sort of a private moment in this public ceremony with everybody in the cast. And I got up to the scene where Jaina gets knighted, and Luke sort of takes her aside to give her a private word, and I had no idea what it was, and then it just rolled out of me. So the Force made me write that scene. That's all I can say. I hadn't planned it. It just happened.
Awesome. I was going to say, was it a sort of prophetic type thing where you were expecting it to grow into something else, but it was kind of a very natural rolled off the pen moment without any real extra thought to it. That's really interesting, actually.
So would you, if they approached you, would you like to return to Star Wars with the totally new storyline now? Or are you satisfied that you did your one novel and now you can go do everything else?
I would not mind being asked again, assuming, again, because I'm a very busy guy, that we can work some time in. But, I'd love to do it again.
Have you ever novelized a film? Just throwing that out
there. I never have, no.
That's an interesting question, Jason, because when I was reading about you, Walter, you seem like you're a mix of Star Wars author Alan Dean Foster and Steve Perry, because Steve Perry does the martial arts and all that sort of stuff. Alan Dean Foster travels everywhere, but of course he's also known as the movie adaptation guru because he does lots of them.
Yeah. He's somebody who travels more than I do, which is quite an accomplishment, actually. But whenever I see Alan Dean Foster, we get together and we exchange travel tips. He tells me where to go next.
So, where would you recommend? That's a quick tangent. Where would you recommend people travel to that's unique and that's something that they wouldn't have thought of?
Oh wow. Trying to think of where I've recently been. Indonesia. I was in Indonesia about a year and a half ago.
And what to do in Indonesia?
Close to them. It was primarily a scuba trip, but I did see a lot of it. I was on the island of Sulawesi, which is kind of between Borneo and Guinea, and it's an island that's actually bigger than England. It looks like a tiny little island on the map, but it's really enormous. I was just and I was there for a while. I was on one little island off the coast of that big island that only had 300 people on it, and I was there for a while. And then I went to another place that was a little more connected to the mainland, where I could get to a city if I wanted to. And then, after a while, I put my scuba gear away and I just went out exploring. I went to a place called the Minahasa Highlands, where there had been a kingdom up until the 19th century, a very successful kingdom, and they had their own customs. They had their own burial customs, which are very interesting. People got buried in stone pillars, little caps on them, and the caps would have bits of their life, important things about their life carved on them. And then, as people in their family died, they just drop in more people. And the Dutch, who were the colonial powers in that part of the world, put a stop to that because they thought it was causing an epidemic. But you can go and see these graveyards, and they're just fantastic up there. There's, it's jungle. It's very close to the equator, so it's very hot and humid, which was kind of overpowering. The undersea life is amazing. The life above the water is pretty amazing too. It's very varied. The cuisine is interesting. If you know where to go, you can eat a fruit bat. It's not something I tried, to be honest. But, and everyone was just enormously friendly and helpful. And it was really beautiful. When I was on this little island, I just got to the beach, and there were 7 volcanoes all around. I could count 7, and there were more behind me that I couldn't see. And that's just interesting. I was later in the crater of a volcano, not a particularly active volcano, I should say. There are actual towns in there, and a lake, and people go fishing, and there are hot springs, and it's just amazingly beautiful, and it's amazingly unlike anywhere else. So check out Sulawesi.
Will do.
The only problem was I had it was a 44-hour trip to get there.
Well, my family's from New Zealand, and so I know what long traveling is like. Yeah. I've been to New Zealand recently too, but I figure people would know to go there. It's beautiful. Yeah, it is. It's gorgeous. And the weird thing about it is that I would look at a piece of New Zealand scenery and it would be Lord of the Rings. Peter Jackson took all the most striking scenery in New Zealand and put it in the Lord of the Rings films, and I was going, oh yeah, hobbits live there. Yeah, okay.
The weird thing for me was I saw Mount Doom covered in snow when I went to New Zealand this last summer, and it was bizarre. It's supposed to be black and fiery. Why is it white? Or when you go to Wellington and you go up Mount Victoria, which is a park. This road winds up to the top, and there's a little fort up there, and it's a park. Yeah, but you look on the side oh no, that's where Nazgul were chasing them, and that's where Nazgul were chasing him, and more Nazgul. And my cousins are like, yeah, we just drive up here, and you see them filming, and horses are going down here with all the Nazgul, and it's just on the side of the road. And if you take the wrong road out of Wellington, you end up in this valley where the Rohirrim live. It's fast. It's cool. Yeah. So we have a couple more listener questions. One wants to know, because you mentioned this on your website about the awards and so on, were you more satisfied knowing with the title that I think you gave yourself, but the Bull Goose Loser, where you get nominated for all these awards and never win? No, it was George R. R. Martin who gave me that title. George R. R. Martin and Gardner Dessois, who are Gardner is an editor, and George is the writer, as we all know. So more satisfied being that, or just another award-winning author, as you call it? Yeah. Okay. Well, let me explain what the Bull Goose Loser is, which is the person who has been nominated for more awards in the science fiction and fantasy field without having ever won any of them. And I had been Bull Goose Loser for enough years that by the time I finally started winning awards, I was really tired of being Bull Goose Loser.
I mean, I tried to be a good sport about it, but a while there, I was just carrying. I wore a button that just said 15-time award loser. And then after I lost another award, I'd cross out the 15 and write 16 above it. Just to let people know I was getting a little tired of this. But I'm very happy that I won some awards. It's cool.
They should have a button like that for I think his name was Roger Deakins, who's a cinematographer for like Coen Brothers movies and all these movies. He's been nominated like 16 times and hasn't won.
Yeah.
Well, there's a sound guy.
I think the special award thing.
Like
yeah.
I think there's a guy for
cinematography in Coen Brothers movies is terrific.
He also did Skyfall and stuff, but he's never won.
Yeah. Well.
Someday, maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe people like you, and eventually get the. We got a Nebula in 2011, right?
Mm-hmm. I got a Nebula in 2005 and another one in 2011. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, whilst we're on the subject of all the many books that you didn't win awards for and all the books that you did win awards for, which book of your books is the one that you think deserved an award the most that didn't get one? And is there a book that you think probably didn't deserve one of the awards but it did get as much as the others?
Okay, there were some. Most of my awards have been for short fiction rather than novels, but award nominations, I should say. And there were some stories that I was nominated for where I thought other stories were better in that particular category. So I wasn't surprised that I lost. Sometimes I was surprised by the story that I lost too. I feel, for sure they're going to give it to this one, and they gave it to something else. In which case I felt, well, I should have won. If they were going to give it to that one, I should have won it. But awards are just a crazy thing, and you can't let them dominate your life. It's very pleasant. I mean, I have two very pretty awards. They're sitting in my trophy case now. The annoying one is I won for best novel in Poland.
In Poland?
In Poland, yeah. I'm actually a very popular writer in Poland and France, and Israel are three countries where a lot of my stuff has been translated. And one of my books won for best novel in Poland, so I wrote to my editor and I said, well, when do I get this award? I'd like to see this award. And he said, oh no, it goes to the publisher. Oh, thanks. So one of my awards is sitting on my publisher's desk in Poland.
Well, I think they did all the hard work, right?
I think the only Polish author I can even think of is I can't try to pronounce his name, but he wrote the Witcher books, which are now popular video games. Mm-hmm. It's like Andrzej, I don't know.
Andre something, but I don't.
Sapkowski. I can't think of other Polish authors.
Yeah,
wow.
I just Googled.
Well, it's Stanislaw Lem, who is a pillar of science fiction.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
So another fan question, this is the last one we have from listeners, is you wrote for Spore. Very interesting a game that overall ended up better in concept than actual delivery from what they promised anyway. How were you brought on to write for Spore, and how was your experience writing for video games, which is quite a bit different than TV and movies and novels?
Yeah. Spore was, I got brought in very late. And they had been working on this game for close to 7 years. And it was going to be released in, I think, September. And along about February or March, they realized, hey, we need a writer. They hadn't had one up to that point. And so I flew out, and I kind of auditioned for it. They said, we don't quite know how to do this scene. And then I wrote the scene, and they said, yeah, okay, that's good. We didn't think of that. That's a really good way to do that scene. So then I got the job, and there were really severe deadlines because it was, the release was any second now. They were already doing their beta test with dialogue that they didn't want in the final game. And so it was difficult because I had to write on a spreadsheet. And I'm used to writing on a clean page with paragraphs and quotation marks and all that sort of thing. But I had to write the dialogue on the spreadsheet for, if the answer is yes, this is your dialogue. If the answer is no, this is the dialogue. If the answer is maybe, this is another dialogue. If the answer is, answer unclear, ask again later, it's this. And so I had this form to go through, which was not difficult, except it made it easier for them to plug all that stuff into the final game. But it was kind of crazy making in terms of the mechanics of writing it. But that's how a lot of the dialogue in games gets written, on a spreadsheet, because it's easier for the programmers, not for the writers.
Is it difficult for you to see the scene properly when you have to basically see all possible alternatives?
Well, the alternatives are kind of there listed for you. So that wasn't a huge problem. The problem was just how, because the alien species were as much characters as anything else, I had to stay in character for all of these different species. And some of them were very terse, and some of them were very... So I tried to give them all each their own voices. And I tried to, in some cases, play against expectations. For instance, there was a warrior species, and you would expect warrior species to yell a lot and be very peremptory and dictatorial. And I thought that was just too much of a cliche. That some guy with horns on his head shows up and starts yelling at you. So I made them very quiet and thoughtful. And not terribly macho, but very, very intense. And so, they said, yes, we've run across you, and we've decided that we're going to wipe you out, not because you deserve being wiped out, or we particularly want to wipe out anyone, but we think you're too weak to survive. And so it's either going to be us who wipe you out or somebody else. And if somebody else wipes you out, they're going to be stronger, and we'd rather not have that. So we're going to wipe you out, and then we'll be stronger. And so I made them very logical and reasoned, but still violent, which is what you want in a game like that. But, I wanted them not to be, you shall taste the fruit of my sword and, all that cliched stuff. Wanted to avoid that.
And I not knowing who you're talking about now,
yeah.
I can see it's evident in the game, and that aspect of the game was good. The only thing that got me was, I don't know if you ever saw it played in the end, but people create their own aliens, and about a month in, everyone was penis monsters.
Yeah.
So many of them.
You would think they could have predicted that, but yes.
They obviously did not think about that, because about a month in, penises were everywhere.
Yeah.
So we need to begin wrapping this up. So we're going to do the question that we always wrap all our interviews up with.
Okay.
We're going to give you the soapbox to promote any of your current projects, current appearances, what you're up to, or whatever you want to say to the listeners. You have the soapbox to say what you want.
Well, very recently I realized I had 20 books that were out of print. And so I have got them all available as ebooks now. So basically, every novel that I have written in my entire career is now available. The historical novels, the science fiction novels, the novels that are not quite science fiction, the fantasy, it's all there. And I am at walterjohnwilliams.net. And there are links from there to practically everywhere. My guess is, you will find something that you will want to read there. Just my guess. But there's a lot of variety, and I've worked really hard on these, getting them out and making them available. So I urge everyone to take advantage of all that, and also at very reasonable prices, I have to say. So that's.
And you have your adventure blog there, which sometimes it's very hilarious. Like I just read your review of Lone Ranger, which was hilarious.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's true. I do have my blog, and and you can go back and look at where I've been and what's happening, and I try to be amusing, at least. But yes,
well,
I do review bad movies.
So we don't have to see them.
So you don't have to see them. So you don't even have to think about them ever again. I mean, some movies are so bad they're good, but gotta say, Lone Ranger, there is no reason to see it at all, ever.
There's a good 8 minutes in Lone Ranger.
The last 20 minutes, once the theme song kicks in, that's when my wife and I had fun. The last about 20 minutes.
Yeah, it was way too late.
Yeah,
2 hours too late. Yeah.
But awesome. Thank you so much for being on. Thank you for giving us so much of your time and so much of your insights. This was fantastic.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks very much.
And I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. This will be up tomorrow, so we'll send it to your email.
Yes, please send me the link, and I will give you some great promotion there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, sir, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Yeah,
All right.
you.
Take care. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.